Hello, Greg McCarran here with Jeremy Roth-Cushell, and we're just going to have, here with the antidote, we're going to have more of a, I guess it's going to be more of a free-flowing, free conversation today as opposed to our usual 58-minute podcast. Second week in a row we've done this, I hope that will make some people happy. So just sitting here on a early Saturday evening, just, ready to do some chatting. It'll be more of an informal conversation. And so, Jeremy, how are you doing this evening?
Doing pretty well, Greg. It was storming crazy last night, and the
Same
tree
here.
in the backyard sort of broke a little bit, but everything's cool.
We didn't have any trees come down, but it stormed pretty hard here too. And we're only about 40 miles apart from each other, so that shouldn't come as a surprise.
That's true. The weather's not completely different, but Kansas City seems to catch more of a brunt than we do here in Lawrence, where there's this thing called the Tonganoxie Split, where their closeness to the Kansas River, the Kaw River, seems to perpetuate a splitting of some of the worst storms, so we don't get usually hit by them. By the way, that's the same Kaw River that the allegations by a woman who claims she is Obama's second cousin, who seems to have the data about Obama's family, says that Obama's real father dreams of my real father about being lynched by the KKK and thrown in the Kaw River with two of my friends for dating a white woman in the early 60s in Kansas.
I would say it's at least as worthy of a serious hearing as Joel Gilbert's propaganda film of the same title.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I agree. That's why I referenced it. That's true.
No,
you
I'm
caught
glad,
me.
Yeah, that's good. Speaking of Joel Gilbert and right wing,
do we have to speak about Joel Gilbert?
Well, I'm gonna. Not for long. But speaking of that whole realm of kind of right wing conspiratorial, attack partisan conspiratorial, whatever you want to call it, that comes from all that emanates out of those circles. We had, of course, last weekend, and we talked about this on our last long form show a little bit, the quote unquote suicide of Jeffrey Epstein. And one thing that I saw out of this was this attempt by the usual suspects, the InfoWars clique, as well as I'm sure there are people within the QAnon realm doing this as well. And I still argue that Alex Jones and InfoWars and QAnon are largely indistinguishable at this point, outside of the fact that Alex Jones at least publicly denounces QAnon and says it's nonsense. But I think a lot of what they say and a lot of what they advocate for is actually pretty much the same. The idea that, the president's secretly working with the white hat patriots to save the republic from the evildoers, right?
Well, but Alex is not really, doesn't have the hope of the QAnon inserts. And by the way, QAnon has gone dark in this realm surrounding the alleged Jeffrey Epstein, quote unquote, suicide, whatever it may be.
Well, interesting. But that's interesting. And there are some differences, I guess, but I think in large part, I still think there's still a very similar style in a lot of ways. But what you're hearing certainly out of the InfoWars sphere, there I go again with that term spear, anyway, what you're hearing is that based on Donald Trump retweeted this comedian Terrence Williams asserting that the Clintons may have been behind may have offed Jeffrey Epstein, so to speak. Now you've got this now there's this narrative very much being pushed that Donald Trump is heroically trying to expose the truth of what those evil Clintons did to Epstein to cover their tracks, and that the deep state media is calling Donald Trump a crazy conspiracy theorist to try and slander him so that people won't listen to him when he tries to tell the truth, right? And so what this did is it reminds me very much of the Roger Stone, and also Dreams from My Real Father would go into this realm as well. Very much this Roger Stone, Jerome Corsi-esque exposing of various entities like the Clintons, for example, but being done in a way that shields and obscures from the overall bigger picture of the depths of involvement, as far as only limiting it to one side of the equation or only various people and leaving other people out of the equation. I'm seeing here that this is just another, and I think Adam Green did a really good video on this earlier this week on No More News, breaking down Alex Jones's disinformation about the people around Epstein and the people behind Jeffrey Epstein. And he also did a really good breakdown of a recent Steve Pieczenik video from about a month ago, where Pieczenik says, yes, Epstein is handled by Mossad, names a bunch of names, but then comes in with the poison pill rhetoric that Trump is actually out to expose all of this Mossad Israeli wrongdoing. But anyway, Adam, I would recommend this recent Adam Green video on Alex Jones's disinformation regarding the network behind Epstein. But you're seeing this here where this is just another classic example of, in this case with Jeffrey Epstein. We've seen this going on since before the election, ever since Pizzagate, ever since we had the whole spirit cooking thing, which led to Pizzagate, which led to pedogate on a big level, and Trump working to bring down the sex traffickers and all this, is that this is an extension of just trying to limit the scope of all that goes on with Epstein and everything around him from a much bigger picture, from a historical picture, and just simply trying to pin it on select people within a certain select people that's designed and done in a way to obfuscate, I think, the depth of just how deep something like the Epstein operation was, and probably still is, even if he is indeed no longer with us.
Yes, and the other aspect that is still being sat upon, really, in terms of the proper interpretation of, well, first of all, the question about the Epstein alleged death, the suicide versus the murder versus the black bag, exfiltration to who knows where, potential. That is all being used at some level to distract and sit upon the question of what is the Jeffrey Epstein network? Who is in it? What's it all about? What's its purpose? And so that still really needs to be dealt with. And there's really only a handful of people that are really digging into it. And people like Josh Reeves, he's been doing investigations into this along with John Brisson, and they from We've Read the Documents. Is that the name of his channel, Greg?
I'd have to look. I don't know it off the top of my head, unfortunately.
I think it's called We've Read the Documents. Rather than, I think that's also a play on Alex Jones. We have the documents, and John Brisson is no, we've read the documents.
Yeah. I will say though that John Brisson, based on things I've heard him talk about, he's a very good researcher, and he's brought out a lot of great information. So shout out to John Brisson.
Yeah, maybe it's Brisson. I think you're probably right. So Josh Reeves is doing some analysis about that. Yeah, the claims, the pedophilia and the sex trafficking is just one level of this, and that above that is real high level financial stuff, money laundering. And then even people like George Webb are doing analysis of Epstein as part of a longer term, really Iran Contra network, and putting Les Wexner in the middle of that too. And of course referencing once again the work of Bob Petrakis from Columbus, Ohio, who in the late 90s wrote an article. I believe he turned it into a book, and it's an award-winning investigation, Spook Air, that really deals with what's it called? I forget the name of the Southern Transport.
Hold on a second.
It's about the Rickenbacker Port Authority and Southern Air Transport, and really it points to the possibility of this being a key nodal point of what was during Iran Contra. And of course, Iran Contra was just one other historical point in this larger network that is at the core of it is things like trafficking. That includes not not a focus on human trafficking, although that's a key piece more globally, and that's
Southern
obviously
Air Transport, Jeremy. You were correct. Southern Air Transport.
Yeah, Southern Air Transport at Rickenbacker, and in the Columbus, Ohio area.
Columbus, Ohio area. Yes.
And that there's the trafficking network here, that things like what is known around the Mena, Arkansas, Berry Seal, cocaine trafficking, Gary Webb's investigation into the cocaine trafficking in relationship to Central America death squads, but then also bringing the cocaine into the cities, mainly black cities of America. Also, then part of that then is obviously the setting up of the Bloods and the Crips as an artifice of gang warfare and the control of
and also the weaponizing of contemporary popular what we know as hip hop music as well would fit right into that as well. It's from its original goal of being, socially conscious, grassroots, community oriented, bigger picture style of music and of expression.
That's a good point, because that's usually not been put into the mix of the hard physical aspects of the drug war, the war of drugs, or the war by drugs, really is what it should be called.
The war of drugs and the war of terrorism.
The war of terrorism and the war of drugs. Yes, exactly. And I think you're right, actually. So that might be a future avenue of inquiry, is in relationship to fitting the question of the war of drugs, the drug trafficking, the targeting of certain communities, especially African American communities, in relationship to the hip hop and the debasement of organic African American culture, and again, the same network that's involved in this. A largely Jewish mob that is geographically has a really strong presence in the middle of the country, especially in the sort of northern Midwest up towards Canada, the Canadian border. Think about the Bronfmans as bootleggers, the Bronfmans as Canadian, and the question of the bootlegging and the moving of liquor. And Whitney Webb dealt with some of this background in relationship to someone like Louis Rosenstiel and his involvement in setting up these blackmail networks that included the highest levels of the U.S. government, including people like Hoover, and Roy Cohn is a key intermediary figure amongst all of this. And then you begin to think about, think about things like Viacom and the Bronfmans. They come out of owning what's their liquor company? Seagram's. So then the music, the literalness of this is actually fairly stunning if you think about the domination of so-called quote unquote urban music by the bootlegging liquor companies.
Yeah, and this is a bit of an aside.
And of course the Jewish organized crime domination of the African American culture.
And this is an interesting aside, but I believe that BET, Black Entertainment Television, is owned by Viacom, and the founder of BET, longtime owner, head of BET, Robert Johnson, whose network I think has really been at the forefront of pushing a lot of these, what you might call these debasing aspects of popular hip hop culture, is now supporting Trump and blaming the left for the bad policies in the black community. So.
Right. So then then if we go to the other side of the border, let's say, of the upcoming wall, let's go to the other side of the upcoming wall, i.e. Central America. And then you begin to see like you just reminded me of now, these problems, these cultural problems, these economic problems that we're dealing with from inner city blight and despair, or things like the displacement of Central American populations. You go and drill down on these angles, and it looks like it's like, oh, a lot of this, yes, is based on this very small group of high-level national security connected mobsters, really, with global reach, with international scope, and you begin to work through this question of the death squads and so-called Iran Contra, and what was this gang, Jewish mob role in all of that, including this high-level interface in relationship to the idea of the mega group, an actual group of people with names, with specific political and economic allegiances, who sit above, in some ways, the national security apparatus of, at the very least, the United States and Israel, if not more, which I think we could make the case for. But this question of the leaving out of the Central American component, first of all, like virtually none of the presidential candidates and very little of the actual analysis of the border crisis, of immigration issues, deals with these hard questions of NAFTA in the 90s, the so-called Iran Contra, and the sponsoring of the death squads in the 80s, which all goes back to, in terms of destabilization of governments all the way, back almost a century, really, but with this clear moment in relationship to 1954 of the overthrow of Arbenz in Guatemala by the Max Fisher network. Greg, there's something like flopping around.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I might have been messed with something there for a second. I apologize. But yes, continue. And this is why, and I was just going to say in relation to Fisher and United Fruit Company, that this is Fisher basically being the mentor to Leslie Wexner, one of the founders of the mega group, becomes something that's, I think, of vital importance to understand. So.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that Fisher, it looks like, hires Edward Bernays, to be the propaganda master for the overthrow in Guatemala in 1954.
Interesting aside, and this is just another aside. I guess you could throw in more of these asides since we're just doing a more free-form conversation.
It's one long aside, Greg, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, Jerome Corsi says that he was a student of Edward Bernays at Harvard, so.
Oh, I did not know that.
He's made that claim before.
That's pretty interesting. And so then I began to think about this. We've discussed this question of the Promise software in relationship to Robert Maxwell, Israeli intelligence involved in supplying it to governments, oppressive governments, including the military dictatorship that was installed by the same crew a generation earlier in Guatemala, that then gets ramped up in the 80s with assassination lists and the Promise software being used as a way to target Guatemalan dissidents for wet operations, for assassination, for liquidation. And that, I guess, at some level, we're putting aside the question of that I brought up before about what's dealt with in Surveillance Valley by Yasha Levine, about the whole question of the origin of the internet itself. And so that at some level, before even Promise and Israeli backdoored Promise software comes into the equation in a historically documented fashion, where there's a direct connection between the use of the Israeli backdoored Promise software to the assassination or the disappearing, let's call it, to be tidy about it, to be civil about it, of thousands of Guatemalan people. That there was this question of the nature of the so-called counterinsurgency focus points of where the internet in the first place, DARPANET, ARPANET, comes from. So that does have to be dealt with, but I guess we should just focus on the more particulars in terms of this question of the 80s in relationship to Promise Software and the undermining of civil society, really, in a place like Guatemala in the 80s, and then you throw that into high gear in an economic fashion. So there you have political violence, and then in the 90s you add on NAFTA, you add on economic violence, really, where you're displacing people from their land, farmers, campesinos, people, many of them indigenous peoples of Mexico and other parts of Central America who have done sustenance agriculture on lands probably for generations, if not centuries, if not, more than that potentially in certain areas. And then NAFTA goes into high gear, and the big transnational, big agribusinesses are given access to this. And so we do want to unpack, in our upcoming Antidote radio show, this question of Mitt Romney, his relationship with Carlos Salinas, the Mexican president, and who's very tied into these drug cartels, in relationship to the larger question of NAFTA. And I think the absence of this analysis especially in the larger, maybe left analysis of the problems of NAFTA, is similar to the absence of the realpolitik analysis of what Epstein was actually doing. That his network was and is, no matter what the nature of where he is, whether he's in hell in the mausoleum, or if he's on a beach in somewhere in Middle East, or maybe in Eurasia, no matter what the question of where he is, his network still exists, and some of these people, we know their names. People such as Les Wexner, who's right at the epicenter of this mob. And there's these layers now that are becoming clear in terms of the question of trafficking. And yes, sex trafficking is a part of it, and it's very obvious that the question of blackmail is at the epicenter of this. It is key to the way that politics have been done for a long time, I'm sure. I'm sure it's not even that recent. But Whitney Webb's articles have shown that there's a continuity of the blackmail operation, and not only a continuity of operations, but a continuity of potentially the very network, and Epstein being at the epicenter of this network. That in the sort of late decades and early years of the 21st century was most obviously documented as the mega group. But then there's some other questions in the background of all of this too, in terms of the technology question. And maybe we'll deal with this a little bit more during our radio show broadcasts. But if you go look at some of the people that are identified as part of the mega group, one of them would be Tish, the Tishes. That I have got this book about the background of the Technion University in Israel. And how
and just to be clear, this would be the family of Lawrence Tish, who was at one point basically the head of CBS.
Right. Okay. And so interesting too, now CBS, in terms of Les Moonves, and we've talked about that often in relationship to his take on Trump may be bad for America, but he's good for the bottom line of CBS,
yeah.
Really. And a Ben-Gurion nephew.
Yeah, and another aside, and just a long show full of asides, Les Moonves, I wonder where his Me Too scandal, if it at all links into these bigger pictures. It wouldn't surprise me if it did at some level. Anyway.
And there is, for some reason, that just brought up in my mind, and it's not directly related, but the question of Greg Palast and Greg Palast's relationship to key Israeli intelligence operative David Kimchi or Kimcha. Someday we'll figure out exactly how you say it. And the fact that Greg Palast's sister, I think her name's Jerry, she works at the epicenter of the Israel lobby. And so I'm not saying these are directly connected in a network, but you begin to wonder, especially with someone like Palast, where he's at the epicenter of the alleged progressive response to things like the election fraud, but he never quite gets to election fraud. It's always...
And what's really interesting about that is that Palast is kind of one of the definitive, if not the definitive source on voter suppression tactics, correct?
Exactly.
But it's being done in this very, Palast goes out to left media, but it's also, I guess maybe Democracy Now! Might be a bit of an outlier of this, but certainly the RT Real News type of, media that Greg Palast has a lot of airtime on, will on one hand promote the idea that, voter suppression helped Trump win, but will also leave out, it's also at the same time just debunking the idea, the whole Russiagate thing is a big nothing burger. And what it also does at the same time is I think it obscures a lot of details that are important about the long-term nature of, if you go back to, like, for example, the 2004 election and voter suppression as it related to, or obviously just the outright, as you said, they avoid the outright voter fraud of the '04 election out of Ohio, and then the connections between the people like Mike Connell, who worked directly with Karl Rove, and Ken Blackwell with Paul Manafort in the Ukraine, pushing basically policies that were friendly to the Russian government. So that's also a problem in and of itself, is that very much the type of media that Palast has a lot of airtime on is very much pushing this limited idea of voter suppression while leaving all of this other stuff completely out of the narrative.
It's a good point, and it also could be related to the stance and this central stance, especially in the alleged progressive media sphere during key years of the 9/11 Truth inquiry of Greg Palast as calling such investigations into the demolitions of the World Trade Center as fruitcake and cuckoo and all of that.
Said basically the same thing about, and he also mocked people who believed that Israel was a primary force behind the Iraq War.
Isn't that interesting? Yes. And, so I guess why that reminded me of that is these key media people and these key media assets, the degrees of separation between them and the highest levels of operators of Israel are one at the most often. And so there's an interesting article that I saw from Counterpunch about how the idea of rather than an occupation, an Israeli occupation, more of like an Israeli colonization of our country. And I think it's a good and fair analysis that should be done, especially in relationship to this hard analysis of these key people and how closely they are related to the core of Israeli state power, really. So this book, it's called by Carl Alpert. It's called Technion, the Story of Israel's Institute of Technology. And there are some key points. I just started reading through it, but it's beginning to clarify some things, including things that I wanted to deal with on our next next radio show that actually tie into the question of the Maxwell sisters. Right? There's Ghislaine Maxwell, who was obviously some kind of favorite of Robert Maxwell. He named his yacht that he was allegedly fell off of, suicided, murdered, extradited.
That just makes me, real quick, that makes me think of the irony of both Robert Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein being taken out possibly by their possible allies. I mean, that's an irony that I just came to the realization of.
Well, and this is an interesting question too and maybe we'll deal with this also a little more extensively in our radio show, but this question of Ghislaine Maxwell, the New York Post, I believe, saying that they took these pictures of her at a In-N-Out Burger in Southern California. The one where she was is basically catty corner. It's a few hundred feet away from KPFK, the Pacifica radio station there in Southern California. And she's there reading a book about the deaths of CIA operatives, really, and about the sort of nobility of it. And so I do think that's an interesting question about the idea of being taken care of, like those, they're taking care of their own. And so taking care can have multiple resonances. That can mean that they provide for them, but it can also mean they're taking them out. And so it is the replication of the story surrounding Robert Maxwell and now this next generation of the Jeffrey Epstein is either a very interesting resonance, historical resonance, a rhyming in history, or it's also potential an indicator of a similar fraud being perpetrated. And then the other thing that maybe we would touch upon this interesting Ghislaine Maxwell sighting is the specific book that she was reading is by an author who Ted Gupp, I think it's called, and people are focusing on this book that she was reading currently, and how it's about some of the maybe unacknowledged dead CIA officers and or operatives in relationship to the Wall of Stars at the CIA. And people are reading all kinds of things is she giving a message about how that Epstein was taken out by his intelligence agency, whoever that may be, very likely Israel? Or is she saying, is it a threat potentially about there's going to be potential upcoming deaths? I do think it's interesting, like if you think about the question of Jonathan Pollard, and of course this is the same network that facilitated Pollard. In the same time scheme as Iran Contra, this network was facilitating Jonathan Pollard to exfiltrate many, many documents from his position, and it's a similar kind of question actually about the question of Pollard, and we've talked about the question of whether the Mr. X, the analysis of U.S. counterintelligence, that Pollard was not by himself, and that there was a internal molehill of facilitators at the highest levels inside of the U.S. national security apparatus that were facilitating him.
Which would ultimately make Jonathan Pollard a fall guy for, in so many other cases we've seen fall guys in whatever much bigger pictures there are. And that raises the question, of course, who exactly would someone like Jonathan Pollard be a fall guy for? And I would argue that very much a lot of people within the, Richard Pearl network of influence and those type of operatives, many of whom are still running around today in the Trump era. So,
yes, and so the parallel with the question of what the media is obviously attempting to do at some level right now is to turn Epstein into a curiosity, into a salacious, sort of paparazzi style media exploration, while paralleled with the idea that he was it was just him and Ghislaine basically who were running this operation, and it wasn't really an operation. It was just how did he get over on everybody? How did he trick Les Wexner? How did he keep this going? It was just his own specific, unique, sadistic traits, his own unique, dark genius of some sort is what they seem to be hinting at. And meanwhile,
Jeremy, the answer is totally what that guy on Twitter tweeted about Epstein's teeth and the possibility of being from Transylvania. So,
well, why are you covering up the question of Jeffrey Epstein's teeth? And you can't find where he came from. He's not from Brooklyn. He's from Transylvania, from another dimension, obviously. And so, yes, this question of the fall guy, too, and it makes me think about, too, the literalness of that also in terms of Robert Maxwell falling off of his yacht, allegedly, or Jeffrey Epstein falling down from the bunk or whatever the allegation is. So the fall guy. And so then there's the question, though, of this larger network. And the question is, in terms of the implied threat that some people perceive by this book that Ghislaine Maxwell is reading very openly and getting pictures taken of her apparently at the In-N-Out Burger catty corner from KPFK next to Universal Studios in Southern California by the New York Post, that if you read back carefully through things like even like Seymour Hersh's, I think it's an article called The Traitor, about the internal murmurings about the actual damage that someone like Pollard did. And I've read things that said that it looks like hundreds, if not, up to 1,000 or more, different deep cover style U.S. intelligence operatives had their covers blown, if not were actually killed. And that doesn't make sense in relationship to what's stated as an ally in Israel being the recipient of these documents that Jonathan Pollard exfiltrated, right? And let's point out too that no matter what you think about Julian Assange in WikiLeaks, and the attacks against him were that he was putting American service members or intelligence operatives or people who are working with the U.S. government's lives at risks. And meanwhile, as far as I can see, I've read that no lives were actually destroyed by the Assange released documents. But meanwhile, this Pollard one, I believe it's widely recognized that there was hundreds of casualties as the fallout of that. And meanwhile, even the highest levels of people like James Woolsey, or how about did Hillary Clinton advocate on behalf of Jonathan Pollard? Did Henry Kissinger advocate on behalf of releasing Jonathan Pollard? Yes. So then the question is, who are these people then? If they're advocating on behalf of someone who at the highest levels of U.S. counterintelligence, it's recognized that this person actually destroyed the lives of hundreds of U.S. people, of American people around the world. Then who is James Woolsey and who is Henry Kissinger, and how did they get away with that kind of thing? That if it were in a different context and it were something about, the Assange leaks, for example, they would not be able to get away with anything such as that about calling for the release of Assange. He put in his time because he had to stay in the Ecuadorian embassy for a long time. Can you imagine if like Hillary Clinton advocated for that, or James Woolsey on Fox News? Can you imagine the uproar from the entirety of the political chattering classes? So I just want to point that out. But then, of course, the more central question is if the Pollard papers actually resulted in the deaths of hundreds of Americans, it was very likely not driven by the Israelis. There would not be, they would not have the motive to go wipe out hundreds of American operatives around the world. It would be a very bad blowback on that. But it does fit in with the idea that there was this quid pro quo that Israel had with the Soviets in relationship to this exfiltration of data, a lot of it having to do with highest levels national security agency, signals intelligence. And yes, there's definitely some Israeli interest in some of this information, especially in relationship to their own situation and knowing everything that the U.S. is doing. Think back about the USS Liberty potentially and the questions about below the question of whether it was an actual false flag to be blamed on Egypt, but the question of actually, not wanting the U.S. to have a signals intelligence view into their operations in the war. You can imagine that there would be Israeli interest in questions of high-level signals intelligence, either sort of knowing things and or knowing how to block the U.S. from knowing things about what Israel is doing. But it seems like the national security apparatus that would have the motive to actually take out operatives, American operatives, would of course be the Soviet Union, right? So is still, it's interesting that, you can talk about the Pollard situation, but it's really not talked about much about the question of the Israeli-Soviet relationship in terms of the Pollard operation. Because then the other side of that is what the Israelis were going to get from that. There's alleged to have been a quid pro quo of a masses of Soviet emigres to Israel. And then at the core of that is some of the questions about the evolution of certain aspects of extremist politics in Israel, yeah. And then also the question of the penetration of the Israeli high technology and security services and intelligence by the highest levels of previously Soviet and now Russian intelligence.
And when you think about that quid pro quo you just mentioned of, massive Soviet immigration out of the Eastern Bloc into, wherever they went, Israel or the U.S. or wherever else, is that when you think of Pollard as possibly being a fall guy perhaps for this much larger Richard Pearl nest, that's what I would think would be one of the logical conclusions to jump to if we're looking at it from this deeper perspective. Richard Pearl got his start in politics through Henry Scoop Jackson, who was the senator who was the primary proponent in our government pushing for these laws that would allow this Soviet immigration into, that would pave the way for all of this Soviet immigration, of course, that went into Israel and that also came into the U.S., particularly through New York City, and changed the face of New York, particularly as it related to increased mob activity coming from this very heavily religious Zionist aspect coming out of the Soviet Union. So there's a continuum, I think, there as well. Certainly.
Yes, and I got a little bit stuck in my aside away from what I wanted to briefly explain about this book that Ghislaine Maxwell had. It's called The Book of Honor: Covert Lives and Classified Deaths at the CIA. And so there is a question there in relationship to is Ghislaine cooperating at some level with the investigation? And of course, who's really ultimately in charge of the investigation at this point? Bill Barr, right? His longtime CIA cover-up operative, part of this part of the Epstein network, ultimately, right? And way beyond Jeremy, his father, introducing Epstein into the Dalton School.
But Jeremy, they've all flipped, and come to think of it, Ghislaine is probably working with Trump, and in exchange for immunity. Come on now, that's the obvious answer.
So I'm
joking, of course.
I understand, yes.
That's just like Bill Barr was allegedly, according to Dave Janda, one of the big-time Q online quote-unquote researchers, that Bill Barr was actually put in as the Attorney General as a result of a deal made between Trump and George W. Bush at George H.W. Bush's funeral, that the Bushes would help Trump bring down the deep state in exchange for immunity for their families. So.
Well, it is interesting that if some of the things that are reported about Epstein is that he was a money finder, really. It's pretty obvious that he was very likely a money launderer at some level, and people can go listen to what Josh Reeves has been putting out recently about his analysis of why it's obvious that Epstein is mainly a money launderer. That's his main occupation. And it does look like Whitney Webb is in the midst of a very interesting investigation that might relate to all of that. And that would be good to get some answers, because there's a lot of questions for a media complex that has millions, if not billions of dollars to fund investigations, and yet can't answer or even ask. They can't even ask the simplest questions that they definitely can't answer, including our nothing burger friend at the Washington Post, who can't even get the basic facts right when he was standing a few feet away, Mr. Dave Weigel. But we'll return to that later. But this question of Ted Gupp and the book that Ghislaine had, his previous books, so consider this question of CIA officers killed. Think about the relationship of Maxwell, the Maxwell network, to things like Promise, that's lists of, thousands of Guatemalans killed, but then also the question of the Pollard network, and that is also, hundreds of potential U.S. Nationals killed in relationship to that. You can then also go back to his previous book, where he was the one who put the question of the Mount Weather facility onto the table. This West Virginia, the Greenbrier Resort, where Congress can go in case of nuclear attack, a doomsday scenario. And there was a lot of criticisms from some camps of him for putting that on the record. He said that it was already had become, they considered everything, and that it had already become obsolete, and that it was just wasting money at that point. But then when you think about, then what does that mean in terms of her putting this author forward? Is that even some even bigger threat than just a question of hundreds of operatives' lives, but then the potential threat of an even bigger scale? I don't know. Is it a literal threat of the nuclear option, or the cyber nuclear option, which we know a lot about the capacity of Maxwell's very likely sponsors in Tel Aviv, their capacity for cyber nuclear war of some sort? Or is it the idea of the nuclear option in relationship to I have the files that implicate the major figures across the world? I don't know, but it's an interesting question. But this other, I think, more immediately relevant question about understanding what the Maxwell network part of the Epstein scenario really is looking into her sisters. And this is where I began to research the background that led me into this question of the nuclear bomb, Caltech, and then now I found out that there's this strong link to Israel's technology, the Technion, and of course their own nuclear bomb. And so once again, this then puts the question of the deep state events, such as the assassination of Kennedy, also into the realm here. Okay, and so I'm just going to briefly describe some of this information, and in a way that maybe we can tidy it up and have it more exact during our radio show. But if you go look at it, Ghislaine Maxwell has two sisters who are twins, Christine and Isabel. I think the other one is Isabel Maxwell. And interestingly, they both have a background in working in things like software. I'll first sort of say what led me into this question of the Technion University in relationship to Caltech and the nuclear bomb was, I believe it's Christine Maxwell. I believe it's her husband is a guy called Roger Malina, yes. And Roger Malina is the son of Frank Malina, who was one of the key rocket engineers and the first director of the NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in this Pasadena area next to Caltech. And there is this whole question here of this circle. I did not know about this. And this is interesting too, that I went to high school, at this place called Polytechnic High School. And it was actually, I think it might have been started by some of the professors from Caltech who wanted their children to have a really good education in the basics, and including in things like math, and the possibilities for them having a well-rounded education that could also lead then into things like engineering potentially. And so there was always these stories about how in the 30s that Albert Einstein was over there at Caltech, and during his lunch break he wandered over to the elementary school at Polytechnic and would talk or teach the third graders, or and that was lore that you heard. But then, so now looking back on now what I've learned, it is so stunning to think about how crucial that little area there was in terms of our modern history, because it turns out that a little cell there really at JPL not only was the potential birthplace of U.S. rocketry, JPL, and there's a whole scenario there, right? Because the key figure there is Jack Parsons. His background is crazy, right? He's a Crowleyite. He's a occultist. He's doing rituals there on I believe it's Orange Grove Boulevard or Colorado Boulevard there, in where the Rose Parade goes through there in Pasadena. He's trying to raise occult babies by doing sex rituals. He's also then directly tied into L. Ron Hubbard. But then again, there is this question of Israel, this Israel connection that is over and over being covered up. And so there's this group, it's called Unit 122.
Oh, real quick, this is interesting. You mentioned the Malina family, and the father was very much involved in what you're about to describe here with Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and also with Caltech. The son it's interesting because we were talking among ourselves about Caltech and also MIT being kind of at the epicenter of a lot of this type of intrigue we're discussing here. The son, Roger Malina, is the executive editor of Leonardo Publications at MIT Press, which oversees peer-reviewed journalism that comes out of MIT. So.
Oh wow! So then the questions about scientific truth, especially in the post 9/11 era, and it was an MIT professor. Was it Thomas Eager? I can't remember the name, who wrote one of the key, if not the key, solidification papers, really sort of like fraudulent science papers in terms of not actually dealing with the totality of the physical phenomena at ground zero in lower Manhattan on 9/11. One of these peer-reviewed papers early on that solidified the official pancake collapse, or some version of it, story. So that's an interesting pickup there, Greg. And yeah, and so this question of this grouping here of his father, and remember this is the husband, right? Roger, the current Malina, Roger Malina is the husband of Christine Maxwell, Ghislaine's sister, who's a twin with Isabel. Is that her name again? I'm having a hard time. This is sort of new information, and it's interesting that we didn't ever really looked at this, but I'm glad that we're going to start to, because it's very much, it is solidifying and expanding this analysis about the Maxwell network, being very much about the Talpiot program issue, the technology transfer issue, the backdooring of the technology, the kill switch diplomacy question here, that Brendan O'Connell really, said was at the epicenter of the questions we were facing, and he's continued to be proven correct on these key points here. And, finding out what these twin sisters are up to, it's even deeper than we thought, and it's even potentially worse than we thought. But then there is this historical question that I think maybe we can focus on now in this more open-ended conversation that helps figure out this longer-term question. Because as I was saying, if you look at this Caltech grouping here, that Christine Maxwell's husband's father was a key piece of, Unit 122. It was suspected to be a potential Soviet cell before World War II that was organizing around getting secrets, technical secrets to the Soviet Union. It was allegedly never proven, and it was let go of at some point. But it is uncontroversial that there was a member of that group. They all met at this professor's house. His name's Theodore Von Karman. He's a Hungarian-American mathematician, aerospace engineer, and physicist. And I believe he was at the epicenter of this group, where they would come and meet at his house. Or there might have been another professor. I'm sorry, I don't have all of the details yet down of this, but definitely part of this group was a Chinese student who, and there's questions about how this all worked out and whether he was, actually a spy, as he was then suspected of later on after World War II. But eventually he then went back to China, and he became one of, if not the father of the Chinese nuclear program. So it's interesting that in the midst of all of this, the question of Israel is still being potentially covered up. And it is, I think, if you go to Jack Parsons' Wikipedia page, it'll say that he did work for Israel at some point. But it doesn't say much more than that. And that's a pretty key piece. If the father of JPL and of American rocketry was working for Israel, and it was supposedly at around a time that he was working for Hughes Aircraft, which of course is at the epicenter of the question of technology, even of black technology, and he was then accused of taking scientific documents that he wasn't supposed to home, and then there's questions about what he did with them. But then if you go to this Karman, the Theodore Von Karman, if you go look at his Wikipedia page, and you
real quick before you say that, regarding Jack Parsons in Israel, according to his Wikipedia profile, Parsons acted as a consultant for the Israeli rocket program, and this would have been the very first years after the establishment of the State of Israel, as he died in 1952. So
it was a key moment in terms of what he was doing over there. He helped them organize their rocket program, which then, this is in the days before they had actually really got their nuclear program up and running, and all of the LACOM, Nuclear Espionage Bureau of Scientific Relations, that Shimon Peres was at the epicenter of, and there's key machinations there in terms of the relations he set up with the French and the British in terms of invasions of Egypt, and then a shift over to the United States, and then the question of the Israeli nuclear program in relationship to the Kennedy assassination, and then all the stuff that we talked about Arnon Milchan, who was really originally an agent of Shimon Peres at LACOM of the Bureau of Scientific Relations, ultimately industrial espionage with a focus at that point of nuclear materials, nuclear triggers. And the movie, of course, produced by Arnon Milchan, LACOM agent extraordinaire, JFK, by Oliver
Jeremy,
Stone.
One more thing. This in the Jack Parsons, I didn't quite make from this little excerpt in this Wikipedia entry of whether or not Parsons himself was implicated in the House Un-American Activities probes into, alleged Soviet communist agents within the university system, as well as obviously within many areas of entertainment. But it is interesting that if we look at this from what we call what a few of us kind of labeled, Soviet Israel, or what the book that called the New York, Tel Aviv, Moscow axis, is that if Jack Parsons was working on the Israeli nuclear or basically working on the Israeli rocket program in its earliest formative years, which you would think would become eventually would develop into what we know as the Israeli nuclear program. That makes you wonder about these communists that you're describing here within the Caltech, within this Caltech network of people. What were they? Where's the commonalities begin and end in terms of Israel and the Soviet Union?
And I'm sorry that I don't have the facts down yet in terms of this circle, and whether I don't think maybe Von Karman was not at the epicenter. He was not the person whose house everything was at, but all these people were implicated in that, including Jack Parsons, and Malina, and this Chinese scientist who helped start the Chinese nuclear program, and Von Karman was the head of the GALCIT, which it's interesting. In the Wikipedia page, it doesn't have a link, but I believe it's what's that family? The Guggenheim. It's a Guggenheim-funded institute there that ultimately founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratories. And so then you can go and look at his webpage, Theodore Von Karman, and look for Israel. Search for the word Israel in there, and you will not find it. It doesn't exist there.
You're correct, Jeremy. You're correct. GALCIT is an acronym for the Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratory at the California Institute of Technology. So you're correct.
So then, if you go, then so then you imagine, oh man, you would think like this guy, he's Hungarian Jew immigrant to the United States right at the time in the sort of run up to the foundation of the Jewish state, and then the maintenance of Israel after the fact, and you would think there would be at least like you'd know whether he supported it or something like that. No, nothing there. But then in this book about the Technion, you go, and I started looking at the index. Maybe Von Karman was not interested, so then you go look, and yes, Von Karman he's a key player in terms of supporting the Israeli Technical Institute, Technion, which has been at the epicenter of the question of Israeli technology. Especially in relationship to defense, but more and more in relationship to economics, and then this merger that is related to this idea of the Talpiot program in relationship to the idea of maybe corporate espionage, corporate technology moles inserted into United States and other technology sectors around the world. So so I think that's actually sort of stunning. I won't go into all of the details about what role he played there, Von Karman, but he did play key roles. And there's some other pieces of all of this in relationship to the Technion and how and I didn't realize this earlier on, but there's portions of this book that explain how that early in the 20th century, there was questions about who was going to maintain the Technion, who's going to support it, especially as an epicenter, as a hub potentially of the practicality over the long term of the Zionist project. And it turns out that the Technion has institutions, supporting institutions all around the world, and with a serious one in the United States of America. And it's located just around the corner from Trump Tower. I don't know what that means, if it means anything, but it's a fact. And then yes, the Canadian Technion group, I forget what the actual name of it is, foundation or something like that, is also a key piece of this. But it turned out that in the midst of these negotiations, that there was a three-way split. They agreed to a three-way split to support the Technion University, and one key piece of it was the American Zionist network. And it even included people who were not necessarily Zionists, people like who Lewis Marshall. Go look at who Lewis Marshall is. I believe part of the American Jewish Congress early on. And he called himself basically, he wasn't an anti-Zionist, but he was sort of like a non-Zionist. But he was part of the support network. But then people like Tish have also been a part of this domestic side of the support network. But it came down to a three-way sharing of the support between the American or the Western, including the sort of Canadian Zionist support network, then the European with the focus on the German and sort of the Rothschild network, and then the Russian key piece. And there's this family that I had brought up with you, Greg, and I can't remember their name, but it's really interesting. Wysotskis, the Wysotskis were the key Russian Zionist support network for the Technion early on, and they are basically they're the Tea Empire, the Russian Tea Empire. And there was even phrases, I guess, like that some people were considered anti-Semitic during the Russian Revolution, about the idea that Russia was the victim of Jewish domination. I'm reading from the Wysotsky tea Wikipedia page, where the quote was, "Tea of Wyssotsky, sugar of Brodsky, and Russia of Trotsky." And so it's interesting. So you go look at the background there of Sugar of Brodsky, tea of Wysotsky, Russia of Trotsky. And then you begin to think about the tea company, right? There's the British, tea, what's the, British tea company? I forget.
Was it the, British East India Company, wasn't it?
Exactly, right.
Which is right at the epicenter of so much of the British, what became known as British imperialism and British designs on basically, taking over so much of the world in the 1600s to the early 1800s for sure, at the height of it.
So I think that this is very interesting that there is this missing piece there, the Eastern piece of that is definitely very Jewish, very Zionist in relationship to this power structure, specifically surrounding Israel and the technicalities of standing that state up and then maintaining it and growing it into a serious power base in the world, and a lot of that based around the question of technology, nuclear technology, and so then this is an area where Josh Reeves is going to, is he's been uncovering some of these interesting connections of people like Naomi Campbell. And you'll see Naomi Campbell is all throughout the Epstein network. One of the litigants against Epstein and Maxwell, and actually specifically against Maxwell now, Virginia Giuffre, I don't know how to say her name, but there's a picture that has come out now of her at one of these parties, sort of looking like she's being, just there to be featured, to be, for someone who wants to prey upon her, for her to be presented to. And there in the background is Naomi Campbell, and apparently it's her birthday party. And what's interesting is that Josh Reeves put this very interesting short video that relates back to a part of Joe Rogan's podcast where he's telling a story about going to this Hollywood Hills, what he terms an Eyes Wide Shut style party with Dave Chappelle, who invites him there. and they're going up the hill and there's this house behind a house and up an elevator, and it looks like it's for Naomi Campbell's birthday party again, and there's this 40-foot picture of her naked on next to the elevator that you're taking up. And it turns out that it's this very famous house up there, the Heliodome, I think it's called, or the chemosphere. It's called the chemosphere. And, you can just go, listen to what, Josh Reeves pulled up on that. That is featured in films like, The Big Lebowski. I think it's in The Big Lebowski. And it turns out that this house was being rented by Naomi Campbell's then boyfriend, a Russian oligarch called Vladislav Doronin, who is, apparently tied into, organized crime, and a lot of, interesting questions there. So there is a strong Russian connection to this Epstein thing, that with only focusing on the sort of U.S., North American, European, Israeli, Zionist aspect of this, misses the Russian and yes, also heavily Jewish and heavily Zionist aspect of this. And so I think that people should look into some of that. And then we go back through history and then begin to analyze people like Henry Kissinger, and what is he doing in relationship to all of this. And I think we'll begin to come to some interesting answers that might have political practicality about how we're going to unlock all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you were talking about there, thinking about, and I guess, one of the things that you do is, you're really good at laying out facts, and I follow up and I pick up upon, factual information that's out there, and I like to analyze the, significance of it and tying people and, events together. And something that I was thinking about when you were talking about this is, among ourselves, we've talked a little bit more about a, kind of maybe a different, somewhat of a, not so much different perspective, but looking at, I have a belief that there is probably an element of truth in most things that are put out at some level. And, I was thinking about this whole Caltech controversy and, the fact that, you mentioned, what was the gentleman's name who was, closely affiliated with Technion?
Theodore Von Karman.
Okay, Theodore Von Karman, and Theodore Von Karman was involved in this Caltech gang, along, of course, with Jack Parsons, who did work in the early years on, what would become basically the Israeli, nuclear program. And then the whole implication of these people in the, McCarthy era, Red Scares that were going on, and the House Un-American Activities Committee and all that. And I guess I'm looking at this from a perspective of just kind of more or less you follow within a lot of alternative media, particularly left media, and one of the talking points is that that was all just a McCarthyite, that was just a scare, that was just a witch hunt designed to to create an enemy and all this. And I think that there's some truth to that. I certainly think that there's a large amount of truth to that. But also when you look at something like this, it makes me take somewhat of a different look at that era. And when you think about this, especially when you think of the nuclear components of this, and then you bring in not only the Soviet Union, but also you bring in Israel. And I mentioned earlier this concept of that's been talked about among a few of us within certain groupings as Soviet Israel, and what has been termed, I like to use the term New York, Tel Aviv, Moscow axis. And when you look at it from that kind of historical perspective, that yes, there indeed was something to a lot of this, 50s, early 50s McCarthy era intrigues regarding treasonous elements within a government, within Hollywood, within the educational system. And obviously a lot of that was weaponized to just push this general basic idea that it's just like the communist, and that term, the boogeyman, that's designed to scare people. And so a lot of that was very weaponized, but I think at a deeper level, there's certainly some truth to to this idea that there were indeed traitorous elements operating on behalf certainly of the Soviet Union as well as Israel in its early formative years. And this looks to me to be an extension, or perhaps the roots in a lot of ways of what we're seeing play out, through the 80s, through a lot of this Maxwell era promise, Iran Contra era intrigue, and even on now into the days of Trump and what we call obviously September 11th, and then what we've referred to as the 11/9 operation, and a lot of the global collusion that I think some people like Seth Abramson have gotten really close to uncovering. And so, I mean, we've laid upon ourselves that perhaps, Roy Cohn was inserted into the middle of the McCarthy era intrigues as a means to just limit the scope of what was figured out and what was revealed. And I've even laid out among ourselves, and this is only not anything I really have any factual basis for. It's just something I'm throwing out as a hypothesis / theory, is that perhaps the Rosenbergs were just lower level fall guys and maybe were involved in these types of operations, and that simply put, they were just thrown out there as fall guys. And also as the legacy around the Rosenbergs is that they were just the boogeyman scapegoats for the Red Scare. And maybe that's true, but just thinking of this perspective, I find the general narrative, and I'm finding a problem with this now. One of the terms that a lot of people on the left who say that Russiagate is just a big nothing burger will claim is that you're using McCarthyite tactics to it's McCarthyism reborn. And I think that when you look at this kind of type of nest that you've uncovered here with Caltech, I think that's even the original roots of that term, is that there's a problem with it. And I think that we've gotten a very limited scope on what exactly may or may not have been investigated in that era. And so I'm pontificating here among myself. I hope this makes sense.
I think it does, and I think it could be very, very direct in terms of the Roy Cohn epicenter aspect of this, in terms of his key role in the McCarthy investigation, which I've before said that it looks like the McCarthy investigation was done in a sort of Alex Jonesy kind of way, you might even say.
I was just thinking, you could probably find some similarities between that whole thing and the Mueller investigation.
Yeah,
perhaps.
Well, perhaps. And I mean,
if they were both, maybe they were both designed to fail.
But I sort of think about it more in the cultural milieu of Roy Cohn and a combination of Roy Cohn, Donald Trump, and Alex Jones, where there's this surface level of a cultural warfare, divide and conquer thing, and that's put into the fray, where the focus becomes about the writers in Hollywood, the communist threat from the progressives and, democratic socialists potentially, and sort of pervasive sort of a sowing of cultural paranoia in many ways, in relationship to a good old Roy Cohn mob cover-up, where the high level elements are distracted from in many ways. And so I actually think it is very likely the case that the Rosenbergs were either they did not actually, what they didn't do what they were said to do, or what they did was not actually the big operation in terms of the sharing of the nuclear secrets with the Soviets. And it does turn out that there was a much more extensive Soviet cell that was around someone called Rubina, R-U-B-I, I think that's Zarubina, Z-A-R-U-B-I-N, and then with an A in terms of, Russian nomenclature for a woman. And she was running a whole series of agents, and they apparently were really close and surrounding people like Albert Einstein at Princeton and Oppenheimer. And what's interesting is Oppenheimer's brother was also in the midst of this Caltech Unit 122 cell issue too. So I think, and suppose the difference is, and this is an area where I think people should pay attention to what George Webb is putting on the table. And, and yes, be critical in terms of what it is that he is potentially protecting, and it's pretty obvious to me that he's protecting something in relationship to who Donald Trump actually is, who he's actually serving, some aspect of the extent of the Israeli criminality where he proposes that this thing sort of went bad at some level, and then at the end of Robert Maxwell's life, and that's why he was killed, because he was against this bigger continuity of the trafficking of the drugs and the sex trafficking and all that. But meanwhile, what's left on the table, of course, and I think that this is where we should focus, is the question of who did the big events, who did the big assassinations. Did the Epstein network, going back and now how we understand it, was that the group that was actually at the epicenter of the Kennedy assassination, for example? And then are they the epicenter? Are they the thread that connects the September 11th operation? I think these are questions that really need to be explored, and the basis for them in terms of these incidents and what we already know about them need to be dealt with by anybody who's serious at any level on this. And then, so that's the parallel question to the question of bringing in the missing Russian element here, the Eastern element of this issue. But at the same time, what George Webb is putting forth in terms of, I think his analysis of what was going on here, in terms of the spreading of these nuclear secrets, is very likely largely correct. And his explanation is basically that there was a global push to spread the nuclear technology, especially via something like DuPont. And that for something like, transnational, oligarchical corporate interests, you do not want to just be stuck in a single national security apparatus. You want to be able to export your goods, around the world in many ways. And so then there is this question then of this Zarubina Soviet spy cell exporting nuclear secrets in relationship to what's also can be seen as the background of people like Bill Barr, his dad, who's an OSS guy who's in this exact theater, and then of course Robert Mueller, whose father was a DuPont man. So that should all be looked at. And then yes, at the same time, the question of this transnational question, I think, is key here, because of course then you're also dealing with the importation of Nazi scientists. Project Paperclip, Werner von Braun, NASA. So not only do you have this question of the Jewish state, right, in its birthing, and in its acquisition of the nuclear weapon, not only you're dealing with the Soviet, nuclear weapon, you're not only then dealing with the Chinese nuclear weapon, but you're also dealing with the question of then Nazi scientists in relationship to, the U.S., burgeoning national security apparatus.
Yeah. And in addition to being an executive with DuPont, Robert Mueller's father, Robert Swan Mueller Jr., served as a Navy officer in the Atlantic and Mediterranean theaters during World War II, which may or may not mean something significant, depending on what exactly he may have been connected to.
Yes, and I think I forgot to finish up this point about earlier on about how if Epstein is being spoken about how he was a finder of money, so not only a washer of money, but a finder of money. and you can imagine that he's a finder of dirty money, potentially, that he then, there's a resonance there with Bill Barr in this story from Chip Tatum and the book The Mule in relationship to, Barr, going down, basically this operation down to Tegucigalpa, by Chip Tatum, on behalf of Barr to look for an apparent missing $100 million of some sort. And there was questions about where in this network, and of course the Clintons in relationship to Arkansas are implicated in this question. But then the filling in of this is that this is New Orleans first, and then that gets burnt, and then it's Arkansas and maybe Alabama and that area, and of course there's always this epicenter, the actual deep state, right? Mob networks in relationship to national security apparatus. So meaning like there's often, military planes being used. There's often military, bases, or at least, airstrips being used in order to transport, all of this trafficking, whether guns, drugs, and even humans at times. And then eventually it moves up to Columbus, Ohio, where we sort of then now finally loop back to where we started in relationship to Bob Petrakis' article Spook Air, and then the question of Les Wexner. And this sort of Midwestern mob, here, and that of course is the question of Max Fisher, right? The Purple Gang, the question of the Bronfmans, all of that. But then not just oligarchs, not just organized crime, but also the actual deep state, meaning the connection to the, national security apparatus. So there's the question still on the table about DynCorp, in relationship to, Epstein and some of his vehicles, I think helicopters. It has now come out in some of the documents that Epstein flew into a naval base to pick up, Clinton. Do you think just some random, as they're calling him, some sick playboy from New York is allowed to just fly his plane into a naval base to pick up an ex-president? No, this is that there's some level, there's a state sponsorship aspect, to this at a very high level. And, maybe some of this we'll deal with in our radio show, but I do want to put on the table that here's the other aspect that hints at that this is actually not just even a sort of a sick sex trafficking, sex compromise operation via Epstein and Maxwell, but it's also this global international trafficking network, which includes an interface, of course, with organized crime and money laundering. But then at the epicenter is things like transportation of guns and drugs, really, or weapons and drugs. And then you throw in the Israel question, and you really begin to see the question of trucking and bartering in nuclear materials, and drugs. And it is interesting. There was Heidi Fleiss, it's very possible that could have been a potential for a blackmail operation, and that there was Mossad at the epicenter, of that. And the guy who was one of the biggest, trafficker of ecstasy was an apparent Israeli Mossad guy at the epicenter of the Heidi Fleiss, sex madam Hollywood, West Coast wing of the operation. And then you begin to see that there is this tie-in. Then think about the malls, and I'm just sort of free flowing here. You think about the question of malls and Les Wexner, right? What is Les Wexner's above board occupation? The Limited. He's the guy who owns the stores that you're going to see at most every mall in the United States.
Wexner is also Victoria's Secret, correct?
Victoria's Secret, Bath Body Works and Beyond, that one, I think.
The Bed Bath and Beyond.
Bed Bath and Beyond. There's another sort of like, adult, not adult, but just sort of like basic clothing company. So it's a mall company at some level. So then you think back.
That becomes interesting, like Wexner, and then I also think of, the Australian family that owns a lot of the malls where where terrorism's taken place in Africa, and I believe also a shooting in Omaha as well.
Oh, I didn't know about that shooting in Omaha. Let's look into that. You're talking about the Westfield malls, the Lowy family.
Yes.
Right. And then, so what made me think about that is this question of ecstasy, right? Drug running in intersection Israeli intelligence, drug running in conjunction with, potential blackmail of sex operations, and there was a tie in there in relationship to the malls and how the malls were actually used as distribution centers. And so then I began to think about the reports about Israeli intelligence surrounding September 11th, about how you basically, if you were an Israeli national and you were going on what's called a vacation, and very likely most of these vacations are because of the pervasiveness of military service in Israel, that you are very likely at some level, at least some significant grouping of Israeli, Israeli nationals who are going out into the world after their teens, maybe early to mid 20s, they're going to be being used for intelligence operations. And so surrounding September 11th, there was 3 options for you when you showed up in the United States of America as an Israeli national that you could be plugged into by, very obviously, Israeli intelligence. And one of them was the infamous art students, right? And that's an interesting one. This, of course, this is all intelligence cover stories that make it that cover for what's actually going on in terms of the actual intelligence and or military function that you are supplying. So the art students, they were going around knocking on doors of high level federal officials, including DEA people, potential intimidation factors in terms of they would be there at the house knocking on doors when maybe just the wife was home, and there's potential intimidation there. Who knows what kind of potential surveillance operations? Were they even planting things while they were there? And so that's one thing, right? And then, of course, is the infamous movers, right? The urban moving systems. There was another couple Israeli moving firms surrounding Manhattan, and they were also around the country. And so the movers, right, that's a good one. You can get material around, such as things like explosives, for example. It's a good way to move explosives under cover, white moving vans, right? But then the third area was this the mall, the copter. They were selling these little toy helicopters at the very epicenter of the mall. And so now I begin to wonder whether that was, and maybe people have already dealt with this, and maybe this is, I know Robbie Martin did an investigation and a show about this intersection of Israeli intelligence and ecstasy. And so I know there's something there. And I imagine that it has something to do with this question of the malls. And then, so then even at a more macro scale, you can begin to see the way that this global mob has these very specific areas that then can be used for other things, such as we already touched on before about shipping, such as the limited. They are apparently tied in with mob trucking companies, right? But then the previous generation, or not, maybe not even previous, but ongoing, the idea of the United Fruit, United Brands, the trucking of fruit, or the shipping of materials. Then there's also then drugs, right, can go along with that. And then there's also a question of the clothers, and there's something there too in relationship to the background of the South, cotton, the Rothschilds owning of the cotton, the Jewish power networks providing a lot of the material for things like the Ku Klux Klan's sheets, for example, and then that ties in with that whole background that we've dealt with in terms of the intersection of things like the B'nai B'rith and the Ku Klux Klan in the Civil War era. And by the way, last things here is that in the Technion book, the B'nai B'rith is there early on as a key supporter of it. But then what's interesting to me is that on the page after where it mentions Lawrence Tish, a next generation from the earlier support, the Lawrence Tish as the head of the American Technion Society in 1972 to 1973. On the very next page over on the bottom, it talks about the Canadian Technion Society, and guess who is, of course, at the epicenter of that? It says, quote, as of 1973, the Technion jointly, this is page 383, this page 383 of Karl Alpert's The Technion, the Story of Israel's Institute of Technology, towards the bottom here. And again, I quote, as of 1973, the Technion, jointly with the Hebrew University, benefited from a Lady Davis Fellowship Trust, eventually to reach $5 million, which was established by the LD Foundation of Montreal through the good offices of Louis M. Bloomfield, QC, and Bernard M. Bloomfield. Sinai Lecter served as director of the Canadian Society. So there you have Bloomfield, which is at the epicenter then of the question of permindex, in relationship to the Kennedy assassination. So I over and over again, these pieces begin to come together.
Excellent points. You were on fire there just now. That was that's great, and even the points about cotton and as it relates to. I mean, this just fascinating stuff altogether. That's why I hope we can do more of these long form, more free flowing shows in the future. But I guess I'm gonna wrap up pretty soon here, but I wanted to change pace a little bit, but it goes back to what we were talking about earlier in relation to promise. And I was just thinking about something as we talked about how a lot of what we're seeing now, I think, is a continuation, the global collusion surrounding the 2016 election and what we've called the 11/9 operation being in a lot of ways a continuation of this history going back to this to the Pollard, Iran Contra, Promise Software, all that intrigue, particularly in Guatemala in Latin America. And it made me think about an element of this global collusion that's resulted out of the 2016 election as well as the aftermath, and that is related to particularly the installment of the taking of power by MBS in Saudi Arabia. And it turns out that it was Saudi Arabia was using Pegasus software from the Israeli company but from Joel Zamel's company.
And it's not Joel Zamel's company, but it's the NSO group. The
NSO group, which is okay. But anyway, it's the NSO group is the software manufacturing company out of Israel. And so I wondered, I was thinking about this in relation to we've put, Eric Prince in a lot of the forefront of a lot of this intrigue regarding this, particularly what's going on in the Middle East as it relates to the Trump the operation to get Trump elected and his various Russian and Chinese connections. And Eric Prince did several interviews in the lead up to the 2016 election on friendly media outlets. One, he did interviews with Breitbart, Steve Bannon, and also through a couple of quote-unquote alternative media personalities, Milo Yiannopoulos and also Stefan Molyneux. And I believe that he may not have mentioned this in all of these interviews, but in a couple of them he mentioned bringing back the Phoenix program on a domestic level. And, of course, a lot of the major players involved in the Phoenix program went on to be players later on, like, of course, General Singlaub, for example. And correct me, I'm correct on this. I believe I am.
I believe so. I believe that's true.
Okay. And so I was thinking in regards to this that it's interesting. Phoenix was mentioned on a domestic scale, and of course, the Phoenix was used to target various people within the North Vietnamese, within the populations of these various countries during the Vietnam War. And I was thinking, he mentioned Phoenix on a domestic scale, But I was thinking more or less looking at this internationally again, and that one of the things that Promise was utilized to do was in Guatemala was to take out possible dissidents, people who could be problems for the operations that were going on in Guatemala. And I wonder at the same level with what we've seen is, NSO Group's role in giving this Pegasus technology, which allowed Saudi Arabia to track and spy on dissidents, which may very well appears was used to track down Jamal Khashoggi. And this seems to be a lot of the intrigue surrounding the bigger goals, which appear to be making certain ends meet on a global scale, and then the combination of using this the tracking down of dissidents, the people who might be a problem. We've heard of MBS's purging of the Saudi royals, the problematic Saudi royals, and so I wonder if this is just another element of an even more advanced technological scale of a continuation of what we saw go on in the 80s with the Promise program, what was done in Guatemala. I'm sure it's being done in other places as well as just Saudi Arabia, but I was just thinking about that in particular, and so I hope this makes.
Well, I think you're right on, and yes, so let's definitely wrap up. But I think you're right on about thinking about this as a next generation, the potential of next generation Promise, next generation Phoenix, even, and you were correct around Singlob. He was working with Ted Shackley, who was the CIA chief in Laos, and according to one report, Singlob, quote, oversaw political assassinations programs in Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. And then so it is the case that then you get the Western Goals Foundation, right? That's also John Singlob and this sort of John Birchie style there that's very much tied into the facilitation of things like ADL, i.e., an aspect of the Israeli government's U.S. domestic sort of cultural espionage program into domestic spying. And so I do think that we can begin to see that even the literal aspects of the Epstein operation, which would include things like surveillance, right? Even if you think about just the house being wired with cameras, and there's more about that too, where you can find how some of the victims actually saw the array of screens.
And of course, NGO group would be just one aspect of a number.
NSO, I think it is.
NSO group would be just one of a number of different types of companies that were used. And of course, we think of Black Cube as well, and Black Cube was used for, it seems, at least two joint functions that we know of. One was to track people who had made allegations against victims of Harvey Weinstein, and also to dig up dirt on proponents of the Iran deal under the Obama administration.
And so then, yes, you can begin to see how this is the architecture or the template for what's to be rolled out at the highest, at the civilization level, basically. If you think about the surveillance of the Epstein operation, where there are cameras everywhere, and then connecting that via what you're talking about, the NSO group and the embedded backdoor surveillance operations to be used for actual active measures, intelligence measures against people in your phone, for example. And by the way, I just wanted to mention in relationship to Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, it turns out, yes, Epstein was working on behalf of Mohammed bin Salman, both in terms of money. He had pictures of him. They were close. They had met not that long, in the last year or so, I think. And there's even deeper questions also about what the actual nature of these relationships. There's a apparent question about the potential gay relationship between Jeffrey Epstein and Wexner. And that a lot of these questions about these, the models and even the underage girls, that some of this actually has to do with the question of putting beards on gay men really who are not out and who are operating in a covert fashion really. So there is that question in relationship to Epstein, but Mohammed bin Salman is a client of Epstein. So that they're at the epicenter of this whole question. And then we as the people are then implicated via this question of technology and how the macro architecture of all of this is that we are all meant to then be under an Epstein, i.e. Opstein, or I might call it an hashtag Opstein, a global Opstein where we're all paying for our own compromise and surveillance. And right, so then that takes us back to the question of the Phoenix program, the origins of the internet in counterinsurgency, and that was the domestic side, really, in many ways, not only, but a focus on the domestic architecture of alleged counterinsurgency via, let's recognize that this is in some ways the architecture of the most treasonous elements of the United States that we need to root out, those that knew about, if not participated in the killing of the president, along with all of the thousands of other human beings around the world. I like to say that the ideological descendants of it appear, what I had seen based on what I believe to be the most direct evidence of a assassination conspiracy plot against Kennedy, a lot of their ideological descendants are now the people that are very much promoting these worst of these policies that we're seeing now that are of everything we pretty much of a lot of the things we've been talking about here in this program. So, very much centered around, say, the presidency of Donald Trump in various areas, whether it's directly in government, national security, or in the alternative media. Yeah. So I guess just in finishing up that there's this question of the surveillance transnational state, maybe we should call it, right? That part of it is that it's not only about the potential for compromise, right? The blackmail of now everyone's lives is under the all-seeing eye of a small grouping of people in certain areas. But then there's that question, but then there's the question of targeting, right? The targeting question, how people are then targeted for, in the worst case, things like assassination. So that's where the Phoenix program issue comes in. So we obviously need to root this out as soon as possible.
And I guess a couple final thoughts on the reason I was thinking Eric Prince in relation to the whole Saudi Arabia thing, and Eric Prince talking about the Phoenix program, talking about on domestic level, and I'll get to that in a second, but I was thinking about this on an international scale as it related to Saudi Arabia and the allegations that there were Eric Prince affiliated mercenaries that were working to torture people that were rounded up in Riyadh by MBS and his incoming in his takeover of power in the Saudi royal family. So I was thinking of that. And I will say this, I guess this will be my parting thought, is that if indeed there is a domestic Phoenix program being put together under the Trump administration or something resembling that, with all of the heightened tensions going on around the right and the left and Antifa and the whatever you want to call the far right, and the desire by multiple forces to push differing extremes as terrorist threats, whether it's Antifa or whether it's QAnon or whatever white supremacist, whatever group is being labeled terrorist, so that there's this push to have various groups officially labeled by the government, by the FBI, as domestic terrorist groups. I shudder to think of the possibility of what a domestic Phoenix program or Phoenix-style program in this day and age would look like. That's a scary thought.
Yes, and even if it doesn't go hot per se, there are so many other ways to take somebody out. If they're targeted, they can be taken out socially, they can be taken out economically. They can be taken out psychologically. So the Phoenix program has sort of gone global and has gone.
That's a great point.
It's gone digital and sort of gone cyber at some level. And I guess my last sort of data points would be to hinge what Eric Prince in relationship to this whole network, what you pointed out about, and his relationship, of course, to questions about what's the corporatization of Afghanistan, that relationship of Blackwater to things like Steven Feinberg and DynCorp, and Eric Prince's, of course, relationships with Israel, and then on into China and Russia, and of course still operating in many ways here at home, but then also Michael Flynn, who was on the board of advisors of the NSO group, who at the same time was running around in the nuclear proliferation side of the program, where he was on the phone during Donald Trump's inauguration about how to set up these what they're calling the Marshall Plans for the Middle East, but was really just a nuclear proliferation under the guise of nuclear power in relationship to this grand global collusion operation.
And what does that mean what does that mean when you think about the increased talk of a new you're starting to hear more and more talk of almost a new nuclear arms race, with the Trump administration looking to bulk up, so to speak, and Russia is responding in kind. So.
And the sort of the limited hangout left, or the sort of left who missed the boat at the very least, except for those that are actually operatives, will sort of put all of that, people like Aaron Mate, let's say, like who would sort of frame the whole question. Or
my favorite person, Max Blumenthal.
They would frame the whole question of the escalation of the nuclear arms race as at the fault of people who did an investigation, like Seth Abramson, for example.
Yeah.
Whose actual, I would say his main fault is that he hasn't yet gone far enough in relationship to the networks that he has investigated globally in terms of such specific issues as things like September 11th.
When you think about it, Jeremy, it's as absurd as something that they like to jump on people for claiming. It's as absurd as claiming that Susan Sarandon is the reason Trump got elected. I mean, it's equally absurd to claim that the people that are trying to get the truth out about a global collusion narrative that goes far beyond just generic boogeyman scapegoating of Russia are the reason why these things are happening. I mean, it's just absurd.
Yeah, and the way that they always frame it is that this is proof that Donald Trump sort of blowing up these nuclear agreements with Russia is proof that he's an antagonist of quote unquote Russia and Putin, and this proves that the entire Russiagate conspiracy theory is a fraud. But meanwhile, who is actually served in all of this? You can imagine that Putin, along with his mafia state, along with the Russian deep state, that's conjoined with aspects of organized crime and Russian oligarchs, which is very much intensely more and more tied in to the Israeli security state, it would be very much enjoying a re-escalation of this, just as the Donald Trump and the people that he serves, and maybe all of these people at some level are in a global network, one and the same.
Absolutely, you could. Absolutely, and it might be a good point to kind of wrap up here.
Let's do it. Thank you so much, Greg, for this conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I hope I was able to make sense in some of my inane ramblings, but that's what these free flow, longer form shows are for. So hopefully now our regular hour-long shows will be to stay more on topic, hopefully.
You're right. Our sides of our sides will be largely, maintained here and contained in our rambling conversations, hopefully. I can't promise that, though.
And we'll try.
All right.
Well, thanks,
again.
Jeremy, and we will be back soon.
All right. Bye-bye.